March 10, 1983. MTV finally aired the Billie Jean video for the first time. The song had already been #1 for 7 weeks. It had sold millions of copies. It was dominating radio across America. But MTV, the supposed music television network, had refused to play it. Why? Because Michael Jackson was black. This is the story of how the most powerful music channel in history tried to keep one of the greatest entertainers who ever lived off their airwaves, and how one executive's threat forced them to change everything. August 1st, 1981. Exactly 12:01 a.m. A grainy image of a space shuttle launch filled television screens across parts of New Jersey and a handful of other markets. An astronaut planted a flag on the moon, but instead of NASA's insignia, it bore 3 bold letters: MTV. Then came the voice that would define a generation. Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll. The first video ever played on music television was "Video Killed the Radio Star" by the Buggles. Over the next 24 hours, viewers saw performances from The Who, Rod Stewart, Pat Benatar, REO Speedwagon, The Pretenders, all white artists, all rock or rock-adjacent acts, no soul, no funk, no R&B, certainly no hip-hop, which was just emerging from New York streets. This wasn't accidental. MTV launched with a deliberate programming philosophy created by Bob Pittman, the channel's first president. Pittman came from radio, specifically album-oriented rock radio, which had spent the late 70s systematically excluding black musicians from playlists. He envisioned MTV as the television equivalent of AOR radio, a narrow-format channel playing rock music exclusively. The target demographic was clear: white suburban teenagers and young adults, particularly males, who wanted their MTV to look like them. The channel employed 5 video jockeys, known as VJs, to host programming between videos. 4 were white. J.J. Jackson, the lone black VJ, came from rock radio background and was hired specifically because he fit MTV's rock-oriented brand. Behind the scenes, Carolyn Baker, a black woman, served as head of talent and acquisition. She'd later describe the network's early philosophy as limited by research based on ignorance. The few black artists who appeared on MTV in 1981 fit specific criteria. They needed rock credibility or enough crossover appeal that programmers could justify their inclusion. The Specials, an interracial ska band from England, were the 58th act played on MTV's first day. Their song Rat Race technically made them the first act with black members to air on the channel. But integrated British bands were safe. American black artists making soul, funk, or R&B faced a different standard. Within months of launch, artists and industry executives noticed the pattern. Rick James, riding high on the success of Super Freak from his Street Songs album, made a video for the track. It was 1981. The song was climbing charts, becoming one of the year's biggest hits. Rick's label submitted the video to MTV. They rejected it. The stated reason? It didn't fit their rock format. Rick James was labeled urban contemporary, which was music industry code for black music we won't play on mainstream outlets. Rick exploded publicly. He gave interviews accusing MTV of racism, pointing out that Super Freak had a funk rock sound that wasn't dramatically different from many white acts in rotation. MTV's response, delivered by founder Bob Pittman, was carefully worded. Rick James is great, so is Parliament Funkadelic. But we turned down Rick James because the consumer didn't define him as rock. Pittman added that they played black artists like Joan Armatrading, Gary U.S. Bonds, and Jimi Hendrix because they fit in with rock and roll. This defense was absurd for multiple reasons. First, Jimi Hendrix had died in 1970. Using a deceased artist as proof of inclusivity was revealing. Second, the consumer doesn't define them as rock argument was circular reasoning. Consumers couldn't define black artists as rock if radio and television never gave them the chance to be heard in rock contexts. The real issue, which industry insiders understood but rarely stated publicly, was money. MTV's parent company, Warner Amex Satellite Entertainment, had invested millions launching the channel. They had expected to lose money initially but hoped to become profitable quickly. Their market research suggested white suburban cable subscribers wanted rock videos. Playing black artists, they feared, might alienate that core audience and hurt their chances of survival. This wasn't just MTV's problem. It reflected broader industry segregation. Record labels were increasingly dividing marketing along racial lines. Black artists were funded and promoted for urban contemporary stations. White artists got rock and pop budgets. Even when black musicians made guitar-driven rock music, labels often pushed them toward R&B categories because that's where they believed black audiences were. But this self-fulfilling prophecy ignored historical reality. Rock and roll was invented by black artists. Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. They created the foundation. White British bands like the Beatles and Rolling Stones built careers covering black American blues and rock. Yet by 1981, MTV was playing the Beatles videos while excluding the very tradition that made the Beatles possible. Rick James wasn't alone in his fury. Earth, Wind & Fire's Maurice White complained on ABC's 2020 that despite breaking all barriers, MTV labeled his music R&B and wouldn't play it. Prince, whose sound incorporated rock, funk, new wave, and pop, initially faced resistance before 1999 slipped into rotation in December 1982. Eddie Grant's Electric Avenue, despite being a massive hit, had to fight for airplay. David Bowie, during a 1983 interview with MTV's VJ Mark Goodman while promoting his album Let's Dance, turned the tables and challenged the channel directly. Having watched MTV over the past few months, it's a solid enterprise with a lot going for it, Bowie said. I'm just floored by the fact that there are so few black artists featured on it. Why is that? Goodman, caught off guard, stumbled through a defense that revealed MTV's thinking. We have to try and do what we think, not only what New York and Los Angeles will appreciate, but also Poughkeepsie or the Midwest. Pick some town in the Midwest which would be scared to death by Prince, or a string of black faces and black music. Bowie's face registered disbelief. Isn't that interesting? He responded with a knowing smile. The exchange, uncomfortable to watch even decades later, exposed the paternalistic racism underlying MTV's programming decisions. They were protecting Middle America from black faces. Goodman tried another defense, suggesting that even radio stations weren't playing acts like the Isley Brothers or the Spinners anymore. Bowie countered brilliantly. I'll tell you what maybe the Isley Brothers or Marvin Gaye means to a black 17-year-old, and surely he's part of America as well. Do you not find that it's a frightening predicament to be in? Is it not possible it should be a conviction of the station to be fair? The camera zoomed tight on Bowie's face, capturing his disgust as Goodman meekly explained that demographics and research justified their approach. This was 1983, 2 years into MTV's existence. The network had become profitable and influential, yet they were still defending racial exclusion based on what they claimed white viewers wanted. Into this situation walked Michael Jackson with an album that would change everything. Thriller dropped November 30th, 1982. The first single, The Girl Is Mine, a duet with Paul McCartney, reached number 2. It was safe, melodic, pop-oriented. MTV played it occasionally, but when Epic Records prepared to release Billie Jean as the second single, they knew this was different. Billie Jean was darker, edgier, more rhythmic than The Girl Is Mine. The song dealt with paternity accusations and obsessive fans. Musically, it showcased Michael's incredible vocal range over a bass line that became one of the most recognizable in pop history. Director Steve Barron created a video featuring Michael walking through a city at night, lighting up pavement tiles with his footsteps, being stalked by a photographer. The production was innovative, stylish, and unlike anything else in MTV's rotation. The video was completed. Epic submitted it to MTV, and MTV said no. The channel's executives, according to multiple accounts, told the label it's not MTV's audience. This rejection happened in early 1983. By this point, Rick James had been publicly accusing them of racism for over a year. David Bowie's interview calling them out hadn't aired yet, but would come soon. The pressure was building. Yet MTV looked at Michael Jackson, who'd been performing since childhood, who'd sold millions of records with the Jackson 5 and as a solo artist, and decided he didn't fit their format. Walter Yetnikoff, president of CBS Records Group, which owned Epic Records, heard about the rejection and lost his mind. Yetnikoff was legendary for his aggressive tactics defending his artists. He'd physically threatened people to protect Billy Joel's interests. He'd fought countless. The fact that in 1983, the biggest entertainer in the world needed a record company president to threaten corporate warfare before MTV would play his video reveals how deep American music industry racism ran. March 10, 1983. MTV finally aired Billie Jean. They acted like they were doing Michael Jackson a favor. The truth was the opposite. Michael Jackson was doing MTV a favor by allowing them to benefit from his genius after they tried to exclude him. Walter Yetnikoff forced them to make the right choice. But they shouldn't have needed forcing. That's the racist truth about MTV. Delivered an ultimatum to MTV that would alter music television history. "I'm pulling everything we have off the air, all our product," Yetnikoff told MTV executives. "I'm not going to give you any more videos, and I'm going to go public and tell them about the fact you don't want to play music by a black guy." This wasn't an empty threat. CBS Records was massive. Their roster included artists MTV desperately needed: Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen, Journey, the Doobie Brothers, Barbra Streisand, and dozens of others, generating hits in early 1983. Losing CBS meant losing a substantial percentage of MTV's programming content. The network couldn't survive that kind of boycott. MTV executives, particularly John Sykes and Les Garland, suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. They could admit their format was racially discriminatory, or they could play Michael Jackson. Years later, Les Garland would deny the confrontation happened, claiming MTV simply loved Billie Jean and put it into rotation immediately upon screening it. This claim insults everyone's intelligence. If MTV loved the video so much, why did it take Walter Yetnikoff threatening to destroy them before it aired? The song Billie Jean was released January 3, 1983. It hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It stayed there for 7 weeks. During those 7 weeks, MTV was not playing the video. Think about that. The #1 song in America, from an artist who'd been famous for over a decade, with a video more innovative than most of MTV's content, and they refused to air it. Finally, on March 10, 1983, more than 2 months after the song's release, MTV premiered the Billie Jean video. Not just played it once, but put it into heavy rotation. And Michael Jackson became the first black artist to receive that level of regular airplay on music television. The impact was immediate and devastating to MTV's format arguments. White suburban teenagers, their supposed core audience, loved Billie Jean. They couldn't get enough of it. The video's popularity helped Thriller sell an additional 10 million copies. Those white kids MTV was supposedly protecting from black music, they were buying Michael Jackson albums in record numbers. MTV had been rescued from the brink of failure by a musician they'd initially refused to play. The channel had lost $50 million in its first years when parent company Warner Amex expected losses of $10 million. They were on the verge of being shut down. Then Thriller's videos started airing in 1983. By the first quarter of 1984, MTV posted its first ever profit. Michael Jackson, the black artist they'd rejected, saved the network that excluded him. But MTV executives would never fully admit this. They maintained their decision had nothing to do with race, only format considerations. They pointed to the handful of black artists who'd received some airplay: Tina Turner, Musical Youth, Prince's late 1982 video for 1999. These token examples were supposed to prove they weren't discriminatory. What they actually proved was that MTV would play black artists if they could be packaged as safe or had undeniable crossover appeal that made exclusion economically stupid. The Billie Jean breakthrough led to Beat It 3 weeks later, on March 31st. That video, featuring actual Los Angeles gang members and Eddie Van Halen's guitar solo, went immediately into heavy rotation. Then came Thriller in December 1983, the 14-minute short film that became the most expensive music video ever made at that time. MTV played it constantly. They built promotional campaigns around it. Michael Jackson became synonymous with MTV's brand, and the channel benefited enormously from association with his success. Other black artists started appearing more regularly. Prince's videos for Little Red Corvette, 1999, and Delirious got airplay. Donna Summer's She Works Hard for the Money entered rotation. Lionel Richie's All Night Long became a hit partly due to MTV exposure. Herbie Hancock's Rocket got played, though DJ Grand Mixer DXT later accused MTV of editing the video to minimize black faces. The door was cracked open, but it hadn't been kicked open willingly. Every black artist who got MTV airplay in 1983 and 1984 benefited from Walter Yetnikoff's threat and Michael Jackson's undeniable excellence. Without that confrontation, MTV likely would have maintained their segregation much longer. The network eventually launched Yo! MTV Raps in 1988, dedicating a show exclusively to hip-hop. This is often cited as proof MTV overcame their racism, but think about what that represents. Hip-hop had to be ghettoized into its own time slot, rather than integrated into regular programming. Black music needed a separate show, a specific place and time, rather than existing throughout MTV's schedule the way white rock acts did. The show's success proved what should have been obvious all along. MTV's audience wasn't scared of black artists. Teenagers of all races wanted to see diverse music. The network's early exclusion was never about protecting viewers. It was about executives' assumptions, prejudices, and demographic research based on systemic inequality. Bob Pittman, MTV's founder, has never fully reckoned with the channel's early racism. In later interviews and statements, he's pointed out that they eventually played black artists, that they launched Yo! MTV Raps, that they became more inclusive. These defenses miss the point entirely. The question isn't whether MTV eventually changed. They had to change because Walter Yetnikoff forced them to, because Michael Jackson's excellence made exclusion impossible, because maintaining segregation while black artists dominated sales charts was untenable. The question is why they structured the channel to exclude black artists in the first place, and why they fought so hard to maintain that exclusion even as evidence mounted that their reasoning was bankrupt. The rock format defense never made sense. MTV played pop acts like Duran Duran, who weren't particularly rock-oriented. They played new wave bands incorporating synthesizers and electronic elements far from traditional rock. They played artists whose only connection to rock was being white and British. But when Rick James made funk rock, when Prince blended rock with R&B, when Michael Jackson created the most innovative pop-rock fusion of the 80s, suddenly format purity mattered. The pattern is unmistakable. White artists could be pop, new wave, synth-based, soft rock, or borderline disco as long as they were white. Black artists needed to be rock in the most traditional sense, and even then faced scrutiny about whether they truly fit. Carolyn Baker, MTV's black head of talent and acquisition, provided perhaps the most damning internal perspective years later. The party line at MTV was that we weren't playing black music because of the research, she said. But the research was based on ignorance. We were young. We were cutting edge. We didn't have to be on the cutting edge of racism. She admitted rejecting Rick James's Super Freak video, but for quality reasons. There were half-naked women in it, and it was a piece of crap, not racial ones. Yet the fact remains. MTV's structure made it nearly impossible for black artists to get airplay regardless of quality. The format philosophy Pittman imported from AOR radio was designed to segregate. When Baker and others implemented that philosophy, they perpetuated institutional racism, even if personal animus wasn't their motivation. Michael Jackson's breakthrough didn't erase this history. It's tempting to view Billie Jean airing on March 10, 1983 as the moment MTV stopped being racist. That's not what happened. What happened was that Walter Yetnikoff's corporate warfare forced MTV to make an exception for the biggest selling artist in the world. The underlying structure that excluded black artists remained largely intact. Only artists who achieved Michael's level of undeniable commercial dominance could force their way onto the channel. This is why Prince, despite making rock-funk fusion that should have fit MTV's format perfectly, initially struggled for airplay. Why Living Colour, a black rock band, had to fight for recognition in the late 80s despite playing exactly the kind of guitar-driven rock MTV claimed to champion. Why Tracy Chapman, who made folk rock that was less urban than many white artists in rotation, faced categorization as a black artist first and folk artist second. The wall had a Michael Jackson-sized hole in it. Everyone else still had to climb. The irony of MTV's history is that their most iconic, profitable, culturally significant era came after they stopped being able to maintain racial exclusion. The mid to late 80s, when Michael Jackson, Prince, Whitney Houston, and eventually hip-hop artists received regular airplay, saw MTV's influence and profitability peak. Young people didn't need protection from black music. They craved it. The teenagers MTV thought they were serving by maintaining white-only playlists were buying Thriller and Purple Rain in massive numbers. The network's early programming decisions weren't just morally wrong. They were economically stupid. MTV lost millions maintaining racial barriers that their audience didn't want. They only became profitable after a black artist they'd tried to exclude saved them from bankruptcy. Today, MTV barely plays music videos. The channel that revolutionized music television transformed into reality programming and scripted shows. MTV Raps lives on as a branded Pluto TV channel, a nostalgic remnant of when MTV actually played music. The Video Music Awards continue annually, still using that Moon Man statuette from the channel's first broadcast in 1981. But the network that defined 80s youth culture exists mostly as a memory and a brand. What remains undeniable is that during its most influential period, MTV practiced institutional racism. They excluded black artists systematically, defended that exclusion with transparently weak arguments, and only changed when forced by economic threats and undeniable excellence. Michael Jackson didn't just break down barriers for himself. He kicked open a door that should never have been closed, but he shouldn't have had to.